Thank you for joining us on the Winning and Selling Podcast. I'm Professor Scott Plum of the Minnesota Sales Institute, and I'm flying solo today as the co-host Bill Hellkamp of Reach Development Systems is out of town with a client. Do you follow your manager or leader? What's the difference between leaders and managers? What makes good ones, better ones, and the best ones? And why do people want to follow the best no matter the role? How can you create better leaders or better followers? Listen up as the professor is off the leash with our special guest, Steve Keating, on episode 530 of the Winning and Selling Podcast. So today, no book club, but we want to give all of our time to our guest. Next week, we're going to be covering chapters 14 and 15 out of the book, How Clients Buy, Part 3. So our guest is Steve Keating. He believes that salespeople are business advisors. Steve Keating is our first three-time guest. He and our co-host, Bill Hellkamp, worked together at Dale Carnegie over 25 years ago. He has the amazing Lead Today Twitter site with over 1 million followers and was listed on LinkedIn's top 15 sales leaders and professionals to watch in 2019. Welcome back, Steve.
Hey, thanks, Scott. Good to be here.
Good. We miss Bill, and I wish Bill was with us. Looking back at the archives, you were on episode 420 and episode 498. For those of you that are playing along at home, and if you enjoy this interview with Steve and you want to listen to another one, listen to episodes 420 and 498. So, Steve, you got a real seasoned experience, a real focused on developing leaders. And in my experience of working with salespeople, working in the sales industry, working in the sales channel, I really see a difference between sales leaders and sales managers. And today I'd really like to talk about the difference between leadership and management. And can you give us an overview as to how you would define the difference between the two, or which ones are focused on what?
Sure. Well, first, there are a whole lot of people who would say there's really not a difference between management and leadership, that it's just kind of semantics.
Mm-hmm.
But they would regretfully be wrong about that, because there's miles of difference between managing and leading. And one of the biggest myths of leadership is that a title or a position is what makes you a leader. But the reality of it is, as we go through our careers, we get promoted into a leadership position, but that's not what makes us a leader. It's the people we lead that makes us a leader. What we need to understand to begin with is that we manage things. We manage budgets, we manage inventories, we manage payrolls, we manage spreadsheets. Anything that doesn't have any kind of emotional intelligence to it, we can manage. But hopefully the people we employ and the people we work with have emotional intelligence. They're emotional beings, and that means they require leadership. We manage things, we lead people. And what happens is, when we attempt to manage people, we create most of what we would call personnel issues, attitude issues, attendance issues, performance issues are largely created by an individual attempting to manage another human being. It simply can't be done. We resist being controlled by other people. However, we relish true leadership. We relish being led. We relish having that guiding star, if you will, to kind of help us achieve our success in own development. That's the biggest difference. We manage stuff, we lead people. People resist management, they respond to effective leadership.
Yeah, I just finished reading the book, The Theory of Accountability by Sam Silverstein, and we're going to be having him on the show in a couple episodes. And he uses the definition where we work with people on accountability, and we work with things of responsibility. And I'm seeing a very strong parallel between the two. And accountability is both ways, from leaders, managers to salespeople, and from salespeople up to leaders and managers. And responsibility, like you said, is the spreadsheet and the budget and other things that we manage, which are things. So there's a tremendous difference between the two. And I think that's a very strong distinction. when our listeners are sales managers or sales leaders, and for salespeople that kind of feel like there's a bit of an angst with the relationship with their manager or leader. Why is that happening? And is it because you feel like you're being managed, or you feel like you're being led? In my experience with different associations or even different companies that I've worked in, there seems to be kind of a mentality of the leaders want to create better followers, and they want to be able to control people just to follow them and not to surpass them. And my belief is, hey, when you do a better job than I do, you can have my job. That
Mm-hmm.
makes me
Mm-hmm.
committed to constantly be developing my role, but it also challenges the people that I work with to be able to pass me up. And I hope that somebody will pass me up, because I want to be able to create better leaders versus better followers. Have you ever seen a situation in the companies or people or organizations that you've worked with that are similar to that?
Yeah, and sadly, I see that all the time. I mean, I will literally see hiring managers who have a very strong candidate, and they don't want to hire them, and they make up some reason why they're not a good fit for the organization, or they're lacking one particular skill. But the reality of it is they're a very, very strong candidate, but that hiring manager feels somewhat threatened by them, or knows they'll be pushed by them, and they may even see their own position as being vulnerable if they hire somebody with that level of skill, and so they'll pass them by. You know, the reality is, I think in companies today, if you have the ability to develop future leaders in an organization, then your job is actually more secure than anybody, because leadership is in such demand today.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we have slipped into some part of this pandemic, but it was happening even before the pandemic. We slipped into some really bad developmental practices within companies where we're not developing leaders the way I think we were even 10 or 20 years ago. It's you know, and this is particularly prevalent among sales organizations, is your sales manager, sales, I prefer to call them sales leaders, assuming they're an actual leader, but the
Mm-hmm.
sales leader departs the company, either retires or whatever, and the most likely person to be promoted into that sales management position is the best sales guy on the team,
Of course, yeah.
assuming that the skills of being a top salesperson are the same skills required to lead other salespeople, which is absolutely false,
Not
completely
true.
different
Correct.
skill
Yeah.
sets.
Yeah.
But you see that mistake again and again and again.
Yeah, that's too bad, and that's really changing the role. I'm also reading a book called Radical Candor, which talks about the difference between a superstar and a rock star. And a rock star is a person who is solid. They're part of the foundation. They just love doing their job. They love being a master at that role. And a superstar wants to go out and reach a goal and have a different day and go out and talk to new people every day, and not really know what to expect, but to know what you're striving for every single day. And I think we need a combination of superstars and rock stars. And we can't take a rock star and make them into a superstar. It's just not going to happen. And vice versa. You take a superstar and you say, I want you to do this routine over and over and over again and be the foundation of this process. They'll pull their hair out. They'll go absolutely crazy. And the
Yeah.
mental
Yep.
health on both sides on switching roles can have a direct impact on the results that the leaders are going to get within an organization. So I totally agree with you. And salespeople, I mean, I've seen some salespeople go up to sales managers and then they go, I don't like this. I want to go back to a salesperson.
Yep.
And man, it's
Yep.
like they make twice as much money. It's kind of like, looking at the NFL. Do you want to be a coach or do you want to be a player? Because the players make a lot more money than the
Yeah.
coaches do.
Yep.
But it's just fascinating to see. So what, in your experience, what are some of the attributes that make up a good leader? How can somebody that wants to be a leader develop themselves into a leader? What are some of the things that they can strive for, adopt, and incorporate into behavior and mindset?
Well, the first thing I would say is, for somebody who aspires to a true leadership position, is not to wait to begin to develop your leadership skills until you get there. We see that all the time, where people say, I will begin to develop as a leader once I'm in a leadership position.
Right, right.
And by then you're already up against the curve. And so I would say to begin to develop your leadership skills today. And it's interesting, I speak all over the world on leadership, and there are leadership trainers or leadership classes, and you can't actually teach leadership. What you can teach is what characteristics make up authentic, effective leaders, and to try to build those characteristics within yourself. And I think the number one characteristic is a true caring for other people. And the willingness to be a little bit vulnerable, to demonstrate that you care for people who you would lead. And I make a very clear distinction here. This is not about caring about the people you lead. Caring about people you lead is a management mindset. We care about our copiers. We care about our computers. We don't care for them. The caring for people, it requires that you invest a part of yourself into their growth and their success. When you develop that mindset, you are just as excited about their success as you would be your own. And you demonstrate that. You invest time with them. On the busiest day you have, you know that you need to set aside the busyness and do one of the most productive things you can as a leader, and that is do something to help someone on your team develop to their full potential. That's what I look for and in a leader. And if I'm trying to evaluate a leader in an organization, I don't look at the leader. I look at the people they lead. Are those people growing? Are those people developing? If that's happening, then I know that leader is effective. If the people are stagnant, continuing merely to follow, continuing to comply with that manager's directives rather than commit to the leader, that's a huge difference between the two. And that's what I look for to determine whether or not I'm dealing with a real leader or somebody who merely occupies a leadership position from which they're trying to manage people.
You probably heard stories about Steve Jobs and how he managed or led Apple. What are some of the things that you recall from him as attributes as to getting the reputation that he has?
Well, he knew his people so well, and he didn't make assumptions about people. He didn't make assumptions about customers, and he didn't make assumptions about his people. He worked hard to know them at a personal level. There's the guy that owns the Minnesota Timberwolves. His name escapes me at the moment.
Glenn Taylor?
Yeah, Glenn Taylor.
Okay.
So Glenn Taylor shared with me years ago the concept of an interview. And it's back in the time when I was working with Bill at Dale Carnegie. And so to tell you how long ago that was, he had this piece of slate hanging on his wall in his office. And he had this white stick that he would use, and he would rub the white stick against that slate. I think they called it a blackboard back then.
Yeah,
and
that's what you were describing.
And he says the way I lead my business is I go out each day and I conduct an interview with at least one of my people, a 5-minute interview. And he said, now you don't know what I'm talking about. He said, let me explain this to you. And he got up and he wrote INNER, interview, not interview. And he said, in an interview, you're limited to what you can maybe ask people. In an interview, they're already working for you.
Right.
And you can ask questions about how are they doing on the job? How am I doing as a leader? What can the company do to help your job be more efficient? Tell me about your goals and objectives. Where do you want to be in 5 years? How do I and the company help you get there?
Right.
And he described the difference as an interview is what you conduct when you want to hire someone. An interview is what you conduct when you want to keep them engaged, keep them motivated, and help them grow into your organization.
Yeah.
And he said, this is key to me.
Yeah.
He said, I do that every day, every single day, not when I have time, every day.
Wow.
5-minute at least interview, one of my top priorities. And I would hazard to guess that somewhere in the world today, wherever Glenn Taylor happens to be, he's going to conduct a 5-minute interview with somebody on his team.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing that I remember about reading about Steve Jobs is his ability to engage in conflict and how he wanted his followers, his team to engage in conflict. And he wanted to throw out an idea and he wanted everybody to push back on it. And if they didn't push back strong enough and the idea failed, he would blame his team because his team didn't push back hard enough for him to go in a different direction. Conflict seems to be part of creativity. And it seems like these days people are so timid about managing and engaging in conflict. And like you said earlier, they get into the compliance. And are they really bringing their full potential to the role that they're playing if they're avoiding conflict and they're managing their compliance? How would you work with, and in salespeople, one of the greatest weaknesses is a high need for approval. So they want to be
Yep.
liked by their prospect. What are some advice that you can give our listeners if they're a sales leader or manager or salesperson on managing conflict?
So it's interesting. When I talk about salespeople becoming business advisors, and as we research B2B sales in particular, the the people who buy in B2B are looking more for not just the common everyday sales rep, but they want help. They want help making decisions. They want help understanding their circumstances, how they got into this mess, not just a product to buy to solve the solution. That might be a Band-Aid, but sometimes that to be a business advisor to your customer, you're going to have to tell them something they don't want to hear.
Right.
You're going to have to be able to have the courage to risk that kind of conflict and tell them things that they need to hear, but that they maybe don't want to hear. Winston Churchill described that as candid diplomacy. And he said candid diplomacy was the art of telling somebody to go to hell in such a way that they enjoyed or they looked forward to the journey. And,
Right.
and that's what we really need to be able to do. That's a true leadership skill.
Yeah.
And so many people in leadership positions avoid conflict like it was the plague, because they see conflict. It must be an argument or it must be a fight. I can't confront anybody about their shortcomings because they'll get mad. And then it just goes downhill from there. But again, if you've developed the reputation as a caring, authentic leader, your people are much more open to coaching because they know that you have their best interest in mind, and you're not being critical. You truly are coaching and trying to help them develop. And I go back to my days at Carnegie. Dale Carnegie said, make a fault seem easy to correct. And what happens to people in leadership positions who don't really lead is they tend to do what I call catastrophize. So a guy messes up a quote, puts the wrong number in or whatever, and the sales manager just goes berserk and it's like, this is the end of the world. We're dead now. We're never going to get this deal. If that ever happens again, you're going to get fired. And it was a mistake that human beings make. It's not the catastrophe we make it out to be. But if we coach and say that's a serious issue, we need to make certain, what are we going to do next time so that doesn't happen again? If we coach in that caring manner, there doesn't have to be a confrontation. It doesn't have to result in conflict.
Yeah. So you bring up a great example of my next question and topic is, what makes people want to follow a good leader? What makes those advocates for a leader? I've had the pleasure of working with some great leaders, and I've gone from one company to the next company just because of the leader, just because of the person that I worked for. And I learned so much from them. And at the end, I'm like, what was it about them that made me want to follow them and put in the extra hours? And I worked for one guy. He was the VP of a company, large company, and he'd be taking notes during a meeting, and then he'd come by my cube and he'd have me 3 pages of legal paper with his notes on it going, here, can you type this up? I need it in 20 minutes. Stop what I'm doing, and I'm typing up all of his notes. And I'm like, and I'm happy to do it for him. But why was I so happy to do that for him every time he asked me to do it? Because it was not part of my job, and I stopped whatever I was doing to do it for him. Why do people follow good leaders like that?
Well, it's interesting. John Maxwell wrote a book called The 5 Levels of Leadership, and he talks about a person's commitment level to the leader at each one of those levels. And when we get to what he calls the middle level, the production level of leadership, people are beginning to become committed to the leader because of what they see the leader doing for the organization. But when we get to the next level, the people development level of leadership, where we're really helping people develop, then they begin to respond to the leader because of what the leader does for them. You had to have been growing, learning.
Mm-hmm.
You had to have a sense that person was invested in you and cared enough about you
Yeah.
that you would literally walk over hot coals for them.
Yeah.
It's almost hard to describe. It's like somebody once said, leadership is a little bit like love. It's hard to describe, but you know it when you see it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the same thing when we have that kind of connection to a transparent leader. I would also bet, by the way,
Mm-hmm.
that person willingly shared as much information with you about what was going on in the organization as
Yeah.
they possibly could.
Right.
And they didn't withhold information believing that made them more powerful, which a lot of people in leadership positions tend to do.
Mm-hmm.
When and they didn't necessarily have to have a friendship with you, but I would imagine you sensed that individual's respect for you, for your
Mm-hmm.
position, for what you brought to the organization.
Yeah.
They likely told you from time to time how you added value to the organization, how you added value to them.
Right.
They share that kind of information, and it just motivates people to be engaged. And I talk about keeping employees engaged. We hear this now today. The new thing is quiet quitters. Well, people quiet quit because they don't feel engaged in the organization. They don't feel as though what they do matters, and they begin to slack off. And I ask leaders in companies, do you know who your most expensive employee is in your organization? And they'll think about the person who's paid the most, but that's not the most expensive employees. The most expensive employees are the least engaged employees because you're not getting return on your investment for paying them.
Wow.
And that's why it's so critical that we understand the difference. And you Scott, at that time you were working for a leader, clearly,
really
not
was.
a manager.
Yeah.
Because a manager, you'd say, you want me to do that now? What are you, nuts? I got my own stuff to do. But a leader just naturally elicits that type of response from their people.
Yeah. And I really felt that he looked out for me, and he did share a lot of information with me, and I did learn a lot from him, and I'm grateful for the time that we shared together. You bring up caring, and we had Anthony Iannarino on the show a couple of times, and
I know Anthony well.
Yeah. I mean, just always an engaging. I think he's releasing his 4th book or 5th book today, I think, on managing. So I'm looking forward to getting a copy of that. But he talked about in his first book, The Only Sales Guide You'll Ever Need, he talked about caring. And the first publisher looked at it going, we can't have any of this caring stuff. That's just a little bit too personal when it comes to, sales and people and process and stuff. And he goes, no, it has to be in there. And that publisher rejected it, if I'm understanding the story correctly. And he went to another publisher and he said, I have to have this part on caring in the book. So I just think that you bring it up and you really reinforce that, working with salespeople, leading salespeople, managing salespeople is very similar to the sales process. And the first is to build trust and rapport and respect so that people can be completely honest with you. And if people are not completely honest with you, you don't get the true answers from questions. You don't know what's going on. I mean, we've heard stories about the Ford Motor Company where they had a VP or a CEO that got really upset every time there was an error, and everybody hid all of the errors and all the problems. And then, did you hear that story, Steve, or do you know what I'm talking about? And then, finally the new CEO comes in and goes, I want to know everything that's going on. And all of a sudden, bam, all of these problems came to the surface. And the new CEO is like, wow, I never knew that was the case, but let's get it together and let's fix these things. And I mean, you can see the contrast between being intimidated and having compliant followers and the impact on a company and the millions, if not billions of dollars of revenue that were lost because of the leadership not engaging with people.
Absolutely true. Absolutely true. We forget, we call them, these people that go out and represent our products, we call them salespeople. People.
Oh, yeah.
Have you ever met a person who did not want to be cared for and cared about? Have you ever met anybody like that? There's never been anybody like that. And it's striking, back in that time frame when Anthony was doing his first book, that the mindset was still kind of 1950s management. That you give people a paycheck, you tell them to do their job, and that's the end of it. And and that's one of the reasons why organizations can be so much more productive today than they were 20 years ago, is because the mindset is coming around to, if we expect our people to take care of any part of our business, we got to take care of our people.
Right, right. There's a lot of people that are remote workers right now. They're,
Yep.
the offices have been disseminated. The people have been, moved to their home office. And now some of them are coming back. Some of them are not coming back. As a leader, when you talk about that connection and that caring, how can leaders that are managing remote workers maintain that connection with them?
So it's interesting. I actually early in the pandemic was asked to develop a program, and so I did, on leading a remote workforce.
Mm.
And one of the things that I suggested was that, at various times of the day, if you have a question for Bob, and Bob has been working in the office 2 doors down from you for the last 12 years, but now Bob is working at home, and you're working at home, or you might still be in the office. How do you keep that same connection with Bob? And one of the recommendations I made was, well, when you have a question for Bob, just get him on Zoom, get him on Teams or WebEx, whatever, just ring him up. And he goes, well, I can't. I mean, that would be a terrible interruption to his day. I can't do that. And it's like, really? And he goes, well, that would be very disrespectful just to pop in on him like that. And I said, when he was 2 doors down from you, did you make an appointment with him to say, hey, I got a quick question for you? Well, no. And it's like, well, you were very disrespectful then, weren't you? And it's the same thing. Your people want to feel that connection. They want to feel as though they're part of something. When you do Teams meetings, for people that are remote, everybody has their camera on. Period.
Yeah, right.
You need to have that kind of connection. You need to have regular time set up, touch bases once a week, twice a month, whatever it is, but with some regularity. And then, just reach out unexpected, not to play gotcha, not
Right.
to see if they're actually, available and working, but speak so you can give them the kind of leadership coaching that I would call a nudge. A nudge in an office environment is, so Scott, how are you doing on that? Where are you at on that
Right.
project?
Right.
That's a nudge.
Right.
Well, we can do that remotely with just that quick 2 minute, informal pop in on a Teams call. And it does help people be more accountable, by the way, as well, to know that, yeah, you know what, I really am working. Probably not the best use of my time to take the dog for a walk at 10 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah,
I
right.
probably couldn't
Right.
do that
Happens.
if I was in the office.
Yeah. Yeah. So true. Wow. This has been very insightful. I've given you a lot of different scenarios, Steve, and I'm just grateful for your advice and your direction. Tell our listeners how they can get a hold of you or how they can follow you. What's your Twitter handle?
So you can follow me on Twitter at Lead Today. I also write a Lead Today blog. We've got over 1 million subscribers to that now. You can find that online at stevekeating.me. And if you really just can't get enough of me, I am one of a select group of people that Twitter has allowed to begin a beta program called Super Followers. You can actually super follow me on Twitter. It's $5 a month, but you get a couple of videos a day, and because it's a lot smaller number of people, much greater access to ask me questions or ask for some coaching on whatever kind of leadership or sales issues you might have.
Wow. So at Lead Today, and they can follow you on Twitter. That's great. I'd like to give Bill an opportunity to share some of his thoughts, some of the things that we left out in today's conversation with Steve. So, Bill, share some of your thoughts with our listeners.
Thanks, Scott. I really want to thank Steve for being on the show the third time. He's always a great guest and has great insights. And I think the thing I took away from listening to this was that being a good salesperson is the same as being a good leader. When you think about your customers, what you want to do is you want to care for them, you want to think about them and try to discover ways that you can help them be better, be more effective in their jobs and in their business. And you challenge them sometimes so that you can help them find new answers in the way that your product or service can do more for them. So thanks again, Scott and Steve.
Thanks, Bill, for that. And look forward to having you back on the show next week. We're going to be covering chapters 14 and 15, again, part 3 of How Clients Buy. And our golden nugget is, people often say that motivation doesn't last. Well, neither does bathing. That's why we recommend it daily, as the words of Zig Ziglar. So please share this podcast with your colleagues, your friends, your network, social media. Tag Steve Keating at Lead Today on Twitter. And we look forward to having you back again next week when we're going to be talking about listening. What's listening all about will be our topic. I will close with joyful selling. Thanks for listening today.